Already, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to. I'll try. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. The State Board work session will now come to order. Denise, would you please call the roll?
Lisa Fricke.
Here.
Rachel Wise.
Here.
Patsy Ko-Johns. John Witzel.
Here.
Molly O'Halloran.
Present.
Patrick McPherson.
Present.
Maureen Nichols.
Here.
Patricia Tim.
Yes.
7 present, 1 absent.
Okay. Information regarding the Open Meetings Act is posted on the east wall of this room on the south side of the door. Live web streaming will be available through the State Board of Education website, www.education.ne.gov/stateboard. And thank you all for coming out on such a cold day. And we welcome our audience where we are live streamed. I'm going to remind board members to engage their microphones before speaking. Do not take me in as an example. And to turn them off when they are done speaking, and please turn off your cell phones. And we have a special presentation at the beginning of our meeting. So I'd like to have the commissioner introduce our special guest.
Yeah, certainly, and thank you, Senator Gurney, for being here. We've had great conversations on the dynamics around civics for a couple years, actually, at the state board level, and humbly, I'm going to say, Senator Gurney said, "Well, I'm just a citizen." Well, actually, that's not quite true. As the education chair and as senator, I really appreciate you coming over and taking a few minutes here with the board to kind of discuss some of the things that you had some concerns around the civics readiness definition and that point. So thank you for being here. Any chair works for you. So
I have a loud voice. I don't know if I need a mic.
Does it go over the internet? Is all.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you for inviting me. I'm not trying to separation of powers. So as a citizen and to make an understanding between the legislature and your duties, I seen in the World Herald a story about the civic readiness definition. And there was a comment in it by the reporter, and I'm sure I've dealt with Joe. He's pretty accurate in what he does, the reporter. So I assume what he commented on in that story is accurate about efforts in the legislature to redo the Americanism statutes. What I wanted to do was remind the state school board that the Americanism statute is state law. There might be a desire for some to change it, but it is existing state law, and it defines civics, what we expect in our public schools. So, reading between the lines, maybe I'm paranoid, but it looked like some individuals thought that they were antiquated, needed to be updated, and that if the state legislature didn't do it, the state school board should. I don't see that. I don't see that necessity. And I would think state statute trumps anything else. You guys exist as a board because it's Constitution and state statute. So my point was, what I wanted to make sure is that we don't have two divergent courses here. What the people, through their elected representatives in the legislature, deem to be what they want in civics, and what your duty is to make sure that happens. So I read the state statutes, and I read the definition of civics, and I've seen some areas there that didn't seem to follow state statute. When I looked at, we talk about 79724, but not a lot of people talk about 79725, which is the character, education, principles of instruction, duty of teachers. They have a high calling, and there's some requirements we expect of them, and they do a good job overall. But in state statute, it says each teacher employed by the state and in the private schools should put special emphasis on the common honesty, morality, courtesy, the Constitution of Nebraska, the United States Constitution, respect for parents in the home, not original ideals, the dignity and necessity of honest labor, and other lessons of steadying influence which tend to promote and develop an upright and desirable citizenry. To me, that defines civics. It's in state statute. I didn't find a lot of that correlated into the definition that was presented to you folks a month ago. Also in 79-724, if any of these things I say, and if anybody thinks they're antiquated terms in the modern United States, let me know. I haven't found anything in either statute that I think is antiquated. And that shouldn't be emphasized and brought to our students in our public education. 79-724, the American Citizenship, we call it the Americanism Act. Is that a bad term, Americanism? I don't think it is. I don't think it should be struck from our laws or from our classrooms. It's who we are. We are the greatest country that exists today. It is our ideals and American ideals that have spread across the world. It is something we should teach our citizens and those in our schools who want to be citizens. My assumption is they're here to become Americans. And it's our duty to help them become Americans, because that's why they're here. And if we don't instill in them the honor to be an American, we have a problem. In one section of the Americanism law, Section 5, it defines what should be teaching of civics, during which course of specific attention shall be given to the following matters: the United States Constitution and Constitution of Nebraska. B, the benefits and advantage of our form of government and the dangers of fallacies of Nazism, communism, and similar ideologies. And C, the duties of citizenship, including active participation and improvement of citizens' community, state, country, and world, and the value of practice of civil discourse between opposing interests. Number 6 is interesting too. Patriotic exercises suitable to the occasion shall be held on Lincoln's birthday, Washington's birthday, Flag Day, Memorial Day, and Veterans Day. I'm curious how often that happens. But back to number 5, the 3, it seems that the emphasis on the defining of civic readiness is on number 3. The duties of citizenship, including active participation and improvement of citizens, community, state, and country. Not once in this civic readiness is the word America used. Not once. National, international governments, civic skills. I have a real problem with community organizing. That has become a political football. Mr. Obama was employed by the Acorn Group, and then the Acorn Group was dishonored or disgraced because of their activities, and it was all about community organizing. I say Mr. Obama, not President Obama, because I believe in the accuracy of history. At that time in his life, he was Mr., not President. It doesn't need to be in there. It separates, not unites. I think Commissioner, you guys are known as what? Board members? All right. I wish we'd.
He's the man.
Yeah.
I get to be commissioner.
All
I
right.
don't know how that works.
All right. Well, Board Member McPherson, I think in his ideal says community involvement. It's the same thing. But community involvement means joining the PTA, joining the VFW, joining a group. We have one right now out in western Nebraska called the Landowners for Common Purpose, of an issue we have out there. That's community involvement. You don't have to organize, you can just be involved. Collective action is another term. I love unions, but it's both of those terms, quite frankly, come out of Sal Alinsky's handbook, both of those terms. And the guy who wrote this probably knows all about Sal Alinsky by adding those. I'm curious about who wrote it, who penned this, who actually penned this, and how does it reflect to the notes of the group that gathered to look at social studies standards. I also have a problem with the makeup of the group that did it. Teaching public education is an honorable profession, but 68% of them of that profession on defining who we are as a nation is wrong. Civics And social studies is not an exact science. Now, you can tell me somebody needs a PhD to tell me about the periodic table and the relationship of chemistry. But in 8th grade, my dad, who had an 8th grade education, knew what it meant to be an American. You don't need a PhD, you don't need to be an educator. As I exchanged some emails with the commissioner. You should have had teachers, candlestick makers, bakers, farmers, carpenters, military on this commission, or whatever you want to call it, that is doing social studies review. This is not an exact science. And to allow one profession, which we all have our views on issues about government, what political parties we belong to, should not dominate the definition of civics. I'm not castigating them at all. I have my views. You probably wouldn't like what I wrote for this definition, because I'm old school. But I'm free enterprise, free market, entrepreneur, and I have a different view. You should not allow one group occupation to dominate what defines who it is to be an American and a Nebraskan, and to take part. And that's what I see when I seen the makeup of that committee. And the wording of this leans towards one political philosophy. You can't deny it. Those words lean towards one political philosophy. Please put America somewhere in that definition. How about a republic, democracy? Democratic republic, not a democracy? We're not a democracy. But according to this, which will go out to all schools, we are a democracy. We are a democratic republic. That's where the two parties came from. There's a big difference. What we should do if we're a democracy is this should be on the ballot, and the state of Nebraska should vote on it and decide every issue. You guys should have no say. A democracy is a pure democracy. Everybody has a vote. So that is wrong terminology there already. Anyway, I just don't think we need to tell citizens or students how to take part in government. I don't believe it says in here about running for office, volunteering for a board in a small community. It's all about being on the outside and trying to change. How about also encouraging them to be on the inside and be part of the process? Run against Mike Groney in 2 years or a year, or Molly, and run against her. Make that change from inside. I mean, both work together. This definition applies to being on the outside looking in and making change that way. There's more to being an American than that. And how about voting? As I've said once before to this board, voter turnout in the state of Nebraska is the civics test we have right now, and it is not good. The results are not good. Why can't we instill in our kids that they need to vote? Something's wrong. It's an honor. So if I look at public education and what I consider the civics test, it's voter turnout, and it's not a good test score. Otherwise, I mean, it's just, I wish you'd revisit this. There was far too few elected officials on your commission too. A county commissioner, school board member, NRD member. You had Senator Chris because he had a bill. And by the way, that bill isn't dead. We're working with Senator Chris on cleanup, along with Senator Brosh, because she had a bill too. Some things could be improved in the Americanism bill, but as far as you're concerned, we have a statute. I don't care if it was 1947 or 1776. That bill is law. That statute is law, and what you do here and what you act on should reflect what state law says. I don't believe this does, and I'm truly concerned about what the social standards will say. We need to fix things. We need to get kids more involved, understand what an honor it is to be an American, not a right to be an American. It's an honor to be one. Otherwise, if it's a right, then the UN's where we go. But that's what I wanted to say. I'm not here to castigate what you do with separation, but honor the state statutes and the work that the legislature did and the people did through their elected representatives. Don't skirt it. Look back at Part 5. And you should have had Part A, B, and C of that. One reflected what the state statute said about education, honoring the Constitution of the state and nationally. And the last one, which was how to get involved. That definition is totally the last one. Read it. That's all I have to say. If you have any questions, that's fine.
First of all, thanks for coming over. And Senator Groney and I had exchanged a couple emails. And one of the, I think your very point, since Joe Dacre's back in the room, I don't know if he's always right, but sometimes he's right.
Read the transcript. I said mostly.
No, I think, first of all, it's good to hear kind of your perspective on this, and I appreciate your perspective of kind of the recognition of the different powers and responsibilities. And I've even had conversations with members of the board about representative government and where we're at. But actually, I actually think this is an exercise in that, right? That we're learning also together relative to the dynamics of civic readiness. I think we've experienced the challenge of how do we really move that metric if that metric is voter, or how do we ensure that we're actually preparing students for the type of engagement that we are proud of to be Americans? How do we make sure that others are there? And I think your points around statute, I shared this with you on email. It was not the intention of this board to actually go off in that direction.
Well, you didn't write it. You delegated, and now you have to look at it, and you can tell them to go back and rewrite it, to tweak it.
And that's very much our process. So we have a committee that's able to go through that process, take feedback, and take your comments as you brought them forward, and others. By the way, because some of this work gets done in committee, some other board members didn't get a chance to look at this in advance too. So our process is do that work in committee, bring it out, similar to a legislative process, and folks get their opportunity on their say on it.
But there's no reason to make political points and to stir up political animosity by throwing terms like collective in there and the community organizing. They're not needed in there, and that divides, not unites.
Yeah.
There's other ways to say it, because certain words have political connotations, and that should be left out.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that 5 years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago, you'd have told me the term community organizing.
I wouldn't have thought so either. So
it would have had no political connotations, but today it does, and it's not necessary. So
maybe I'll make sure the president, if she has anything else. So.
Well, no, thank you so much for coming. And as Matt said, we do have a process, and we do take everyone's comments and take them back and look at what we're doing. And we will continue with that. We have a committee that met this morning, and we will go back and take your comments, and staff will join us with that, and that will be examined again. And because we want to give everyone the opportunity, and we also want to honor our process. Board members.
Senator Gurney, thank you for being here as well and for your comments. And I think one of the things that's important in this process is we, over the past couple of years, have heard from stakeholders in many capacities that we're maybe not doing enough around the understanding of civics and civic readiness and what that might be. And so as we went through a strategic planning process as a board, we identified that area as a goal for us that was important for us to look at adopting a more comprehensive approach to define and measure civic readiness. And this is just the beginning of that process, and it's not in any way to take away from the statutory responsibilities that are already in place. It's to determine how do we move forward in that process. Some of the things we've been hearing over the past few years is the need to be more intentional about how do we really address civics, and how are we making sure that it is a part of the expectations that we have. And that became important for us as a board in our strategic planning process. So I think this is just the beginning of a conversation that hopefully over the next few years civic readiness and what that means becomes a really central theme of the board and the work that we do. In fact, you just answered one of the questions I hadn't thought about. When we talk about in our goals, how do we measure civic readiness, you gave us the answer. And that's about voting and voter turnout. And so my question, I just made a note that we'll have discussions on, is how do we look at voter turnout for young people? That is a great example of a measure that says, were we doing our job very well as we prepare young people to take on their responsibilities as citizens in this country. So we appreciate your input. We appreciate you being here today. This is the beginning of a process for us to really establish a goal and a direction that clearly articulates the responsibility of civics, and civics readiness is really an important part of the educational system in Nebraska. Thank you for being here.
Appreciate it, but we need 40-year-old
I
people to
believe
vote
Mr.
too.
McPherson.
Well, again, thank you, Senator Groney. It's probably not a surprise to anyone that I've had a couple conversations with the senator. I've also had conversations with 10 or 15 other folks about this definition, and I think they all shared concerns. And again, that's the reason I submitted a different version of that, and it's not perfect. It wouldn't be perfect for all those people that talked to me and said it needed to be changed, and I know it's not perfect for some of the folks that composed the original definition, but I think it's important that we discuss this. For most of us, I think it's a prelude to what we're going to see on social studies standards when they're presented to us, and there are a lot of folks that I think rightfully are concerned what those standards might look like when they're presented in, I presume, the spring, if I'm not incorrect. When will they be presented?
2020.
2020? Okay. Well, regardless, I think there are a lot of people that are concerned about what this definition does and how that might impact those standards as well. So I think, I respect the opinion of my fellow board members, and I certainly respect your opinion, and I think we've got you point out a really good point. We just need to listen to more folks when we do these things. I've talked about engagement, I've talked about reaching out to parents, and we still fail to do that job as well as we could. We need to find a better way to engage parents and members of the community. And you're right, it shouldn't be just educators on any of these things. We need that public input. So we're educating 300,000 some children in this state. We got their future at stake. So, and my gosh, if we're not listening to the parents and the business leaders and the elected officials and the others in the community, we're failing. And we need to have that input. So thank you again, Senator.
Appreciate inviting me. I
No, just
understand there probably will be changes made to the Americanism laws, so there might be an amendment by somebody who defines civics for you. Readiness. I mean, it's,
We'd
That's
be
the
happy
give and
to
take.
engage in that process too, so.
and I appreciate working with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much
sir. We need to do
for
that.
taking time out of your busy schedule and visiting with us.
Thank you.
We're going to take about a 10-minute break. You're gonna put that in my evaluation, aren't you? Uh, Good afternoon again. Thank you for joining us. We will now continue with our work session, and we will hear from Commissioner Bloomstead on his report.
Well, first of all, once again, just thanks. I don't get too many opportunities to sit in front of you and take 3 hours to present to you, so I was going to do that today. I'm joking.
I did not discuss that time with you.
Obviously, we're in a kind of an interesting moment in time for a couple different reasons. So I want to set a bit of the context. Number one, we're at the kind of the end of our first year cycle relative to the strategic plan, and we had some good conversations in the strategic planning committee that I might kind of break up some things I was originally going to say here. I might go ahead and wait for the strategic planning committee conversation. But also the importance of me presenting to you to really kind of kick off the commissioner's appraisal work that would happen. We've changed the time frame. Normally you would be evaluating and voting whether or not you wanted me to stick around any longer, probably at this meeting or the January meeting. And that time frame, just to remind you, actually has shifted, and we've gone off into the summer. So the appraisal committee, and John has worked with me, and the committee has worked with me to kind of reset that time frame. But it's really very much a transition from how we used to do things to how I think we want to do things in the future. And I wanted to dive into a little bit of that conversation with you today. I think it's always it's appropriate. We kind of set a theme for the year around bridging connections and really taking charge of our roles and responsibilities. And even pretty much every conversation we have here is really about, well, are we really doing the work that we're supposed to do? Are we really being responsible for the work that we're supposed to have? And so I'll just remind us of this. I'm not going to go into great detail on each of these because you're familiar with them, but within our strategic plan, it's really very important that we are thoughtful about the various roles that are established there, and they're informative, I think, to the board, but also very informative to what I do. It gives me some guidance and direction to how to think about our work, but also to our staff. And as we continue to do this work, it's a foundation for the strategic plan in many ways, because actually these roles were established by reaching out to stakeholders around the state, asking them what they thought we did and what you thought we should be doing. And so these roles were really highlighted there. I do think this notion of champions is important, that we think about the engaging stakeholders and how we do that well. And every conversation we have, there's another reason to think about that even a little bit deeper. And the fact that we do play a policy leadership role, and the fact that we do have to advocate for the necessary resources to be able to accomplish our vision, and really more importantly the vision for education in the state of Nebraska. That we play that important role as regulator, that we do set boundaries around folks and have expectations. That's part of our job, that's part of our role. At the same point, I think you said very, very strongly in the strategic plan we should leverage that role to actually help others go beyond that compliance mode and actually think differently about that role, and not just simply be a check the box type of board and not a check the box type of agency. We have to think about also how we build capacity around the state, and we do this in a lot of different ways. But our capacity itself is not enough to accomplish the work that we have. It's really the capacity of the whole education system and how we ensure that we're in building on that capacity at a community level, at a parent and family level, certainly at a teacher and administrator level, but we should provide some leadership in that arena, thinking about what really makes a difference and what really works. And so we have to communicate those best practices, and we have to think about what those strong relationships are. We have to be a connector where we really try to bridge the divides between folks, and I think we play that role on a regular basis, and I think that's a quite important thing. But we also have to continue to do our work to convene and partner with those that'll help us do that connector work. And then change agent. I mean, if there's something that we don't believe is right, we ought to work quite hard to make a difference in that. And I've used the term around accountability, that accountability is more than just knowing something, but also doing something. You can't just have the knowing something side of it. It's not enough. I will actually say, I think part of our work on thinking about accountability systems has been, now we have this data, what are we going to do? And I'll have a little bit of a chance, and that kind of goes into the strategic plan. Once you understand that we have achievement gaps as we have them, how do what do we do next? What's our next logical steps? And so I think it's a really important role, and we have to pick that path. And I know I've used before the Martin Luther King Jr. quotes from his time in Lincoln. It's an equity piece as well, that when we see things that are inequitable, or we see results that are inequitable, we have to play the change agent role. And so I say that, and then this is some advice from the past, and I'll explain more, but I'm going to read it to you. Perhaps the most difficult scenario is to exercise both the role of leader and regulator. Balancing the ever-changing education policy environment and pointing out the known battlefronts is likely to be a critical role for any commissioner of education. Providing a credible balance between policymakers and school districts, as well as leading effective communication between school districts, will continue to be important. Written by a very brilliant person, not so much. This was written by me. Right? This was written by me in my dissertation with my grand advice to a commissioner who I never thought I would be the commissioner of education when I wrote this, quite frankly. And it sometimes hurts to go back and go back and find things you wrote before. Actually, I think Rachel found something I wrote before just recently, and it sometimes hurts because it's like I'm either no smarter than I was then, or thinking about this, it's a much bigger job than I could have imagined it from afar, right? I mean, I think your job's a much bigger job than you probably could imagine it from afar. But I also don't think that there's anything more important than us trying to balance those roles. I do think it's hard to be a leader and at the same point a regulator. I do think it's hard to communicate things well and partner with others. I do think it's hard to do all those things, but that's my job, right? I mean, that's what you've hired me to do. That's what you've asked me to do, and I try to live up to my own advice from the past, I suppose. Looking back, not quite so far, I wanted to highlight just a few of the things that are goals that were used in my evaluation process before. And I had to reflect a little bit on this. I remember writing goals, and actually Rachel was president at that time, trying to write these goals out kind of by myself and really wanting not to do that work myself. I really wanted to do that with the board, but it was important that we establish some things that we thought should be accomplished in the I don't remember exactly how we did it, but I'm pretty sure the appraisal committee at that point met and said, yes, those are appropriate goals, Commissioner, go do that work. And I had laid it out in a fashion that was kind of initial goals, and then somewhat midterm goals, and then longer term goals, and that's really been the basis of my evaluation in the past. That and the general competencies and other expectations you might have for me. I just wanted to go through a few of these, and I don't know how easy they are to read, and I'll highlight a few of them. Number one, early on, and I'm pretty sure it was March or April when I was writing this in 2014, right? I said we need to implement our next generation accountability system. We need to find a way that we build this, envision it, and move that framework forward, and we started that work. This was all predated AQuest, but right when I showed up on the scene, it was an important topic for the board, and so that obviously became among those initial goals. We had to think about continuing to implement strategies to better engage key educational stakeholders, and that hasn't gone away. We keep working on it, but I feel as if our relationships have continued to improve with others. We continue to think about how we can do that even better, but even more work to do constantly. That we thought about processes that improve the procedures of the regular state board meetings and encourage board member leadership through policy engagement, and I'm proud of all of the changes that we've made in the board practice. The intention of the committees that we now have focused on our plan and our vision for the future, and that's part of that work. The notion of thinking about communications differently, and when I arrived, we didn't necessarily have a communications department. We have a communications department today doing really great things, and if you look at their work on what they've done on website, if you look at those things, and we continue to think about how those systems come together, and that was done early, at least in concept, that we had to accomplish that work. And then identifying the key investments in the department is always an ongoing part of the commissioner's responsibilities, and we do that together. And again, the changes we made with the board to provide leadership in those areas, I think, is important. The midterm goals, which realistically we're kind of in the midterm, I guess I'm midlife or whatever it may be, I guess, for me. But the reality is that here we are implementing what we said we were going to do. Here we are, I establish a P12 chief information officer. when I imagined this before, we needed authorities to be able to do things differently. And then when I got here and looking across the agency, we needed to think differently. And so we've started some of those processes on organization that were important. I put this policy analysis center. I had no idea what I meant by that probably at that point in time, but we have data research and evaluation, and we continue to invest in our ability to use information to inform what we do, not just as a board, but for the system of education. We continue to work on data systems on the P20 workforce. We continue to think about partnerships for blended learning. These are things that are still ongoing and important to us, and we've made progress on that. We've made a lot of steps in that arena, and continue to do that. And then I had even longer term goals, and I think these are things that still are quite on my radar, that we think about ensuring that our educator preparation programs are among the best in the nation and the world, and thinking about how we can provide leadership there, thinking about and we're doing it now. I actually think the state board's kind of ahead of this as we think about really preparing students to be college, career, and civic ready, and our investment in a strategic plan that starts to talk about that differently. And I love this notion of report progress annually through multiple measure and reports aligned to your vision, right? So we were thinking about that from a long-term perspective back then, and here we are trying to get that implemented and make sure that system's coming together. So I'm pleased with that. I'm pleased with, I put the notion clear back then of trying to compare ourselves to the rest of the world, and I still feel like someday I want to get that speech done of, why the United States is X number in the world for education, and how Nebraska can out Finland, right? I mean, this notion of how we can actually be among the best education systems in the world, and I think we have to be able to measure and have that goal and have that in mind. And we have to think about how we continue to do our work with community leaders, business leaders, others, and I think we've actually established relationships with economic development, Department of Labor, in ways that did not exist before. Health and Human Services that did not exist before. Now, probation and other groups that work with us on a regular basis, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court that I get a chance to work with, and I'm humbled by the amount of connections that we're able to build and be a leader in that arena. And so we continue to do that, and I continue to see that as an aspiration for our work together. But really thinking about looking ahead, and we went through several different iterations of taking the board's strategic plan and thinking about how that was implemented at the agency. And implementing that plan, there's been several things, and I'm going to go through some of this, and it might make sense I come back to for the strategic planning conversation at the end to kind of hit some of those particular highlights. But I really tried to look at how we were going to pull that off, and I used the very thing that you put in the strategic plan, the notion of, you set strategic priorities and goals, and say go build the implementation plan that consists of strategies and activities, and monitor and evaluate that, and then develop a process in which we'll have an external review. And I think that's one of the things I'd like to talk with you, but as a part of the strategic planning committee conversation. I really looked at this, and we talked about how we organize and create an aligned organization where the department is accountable for our work as an agency, where our services and programs that we provide are accountable as well, and then we're thinking about the quality of those particular ones, and then we're thinking about our role in school accountability, and so the structure of the plan itself, or the vision and direction itself, lend itself to this. We looked at the strategic priorities, and over on the left-hand side, you'll see one that I think is increase the number of Nebraskans who are ready for success in post-secondary education, career, and civic life. That was one of your priorities. The second priority is ensure all Nebraskans, regardless of background or circumstances, have equitable access to opportunities for success. And we actually crafted the third one as part of our effort to implement, because when we looked at the strategic plan overall, that we thought ensuring the education system, including the Department of Education, are taking charge of the roles and responsibilities to provide leadership. We're putting that right into our implementation of that work. And then, the greatest thing you get to do as commissioners is try to delegate a lot of work to a lot of other people. I'm very proud of the work that we've done to shape the the role of deputies within this agency. Just a year ago, we didn't have this structure in place. I did not have the 3 deputies that I'm proud to be able to associate with and work with on a regular basis. So Dr. Friesen and Mark Schultz and Brian Halstead all have roles underneath this and expectations underneath this particular operational plan. I'm not going to go into every element and detail of this, but we really started to look at it and going, hey, look, we're interested about individual success and student success, and there's metrics. All of the board's metrics line up underneath, or many of the board's metrics line up underneath that part. We're interested in ensuring that schools are successful and improving, and so that work lines up underneath that second priority. And then the agency work itself, that we're going to get better and better and better as an agency, lines up under that third component. And so there's responsibilities for each of the deputies underneath that. The board has a couple different types of goals. One type of goal is what I kind of consider an activity-based type of goal, a little bit shorter term approach, and I use the example because I wanted to talk about this a little bit later. The example of board goal 6.1, it says by 2018, utilizing baseline data from the ACT, long-term goals will be developed for the 11th grade achievement, including excluding goals for subgroups. Just last week, we released the first time the statewide ACT data, and it's establishing that baseline. We have to now collectively be able to do that work to set what those long-term goals are, and I think that's an important thing. But that's one thing that gets us to the next type of metric, and this one's just another for instance. By 2026, the 7-year cohort graduation rates for all Nebraska students will be greater than 95% and not less than 90% for any one subgroup, right? And there's a lot of folks that can look at that and go, but I'm going to show you data later, that you start to realize, all right, we have some work to do, and there's some challenges and areas in which we need to do that work, and I'll use those examples at a little later time. These activity-based goals fall into those categories as well, and and then the and there are not as many of those. There's essentially 8 of those goals that we have. On each one of those, you can see that we've made progress, especially on the ones that say by 2018. What happened, baseline benchmarks to track students that have a disability, is really largely a VR benchmarking piece that they're actually getting ready to be able to roll with and be able to report on. The 2018 comprehensive approach to define and measure civic readiness, right? We're working on it right now. We're going to work on it and keep working on it. But the reason that we're doing that work is because you said go do that work, right? I mean, that's why it's there, and we continue to try to accomplish that. Looking at how we implement our assessment system, I think we can be quite proud of what we've done so far on an assessment system. We've started to shift the whole direction of assessment in Nebraska and thinking very differently. ACT certainly in high school, but what we're doing grades 3 through 8, and now how we're thinking about tying those systems together and being thoughtful there. That's implementing that vision that you've had. We had a teacher equity plan already kind of in the works and there, but it's already time to go and review that and go, how's that making a difference? And I had laid out at administrator days the importance of us actually having a teacher population that actually would match our student demographics in the future, and that's a high bar as well. When we start to look at that, we want to make sure we have great teachers all over the state that really connect well with their students regardless of background. So, and we have the 2020 develop a statewide digital course and content repository. We're looking for championing that effort still, looking for resources, finding ways to try to accomplish that work. I mentioned the ACT baseline, in 2019 the system to regularly engage, survey client. This kind of comes back to our notion of how we're going to actually engage with the public in a different way, and finding that way to accomplish that work is really quite critical. And then actually that other one shows up there twice, and let me explain why. There's a technical side and a digital content side that's really about instruction in schools, right? So it kind of shows up in a couple different places. I'm going to skip over these because I want to come back to a little bit of this conversation, and I want to hit these priorities, and then if you'll allow me, I'll come back and do some data work with you during the strategic planning committee report. We laid out a sense of what matters most within the agency. We worked across the agency looking at a lot of different activities that were already underway, as well as activities that aligned with the state board's goals.
it gets hard to prioritize those things. And by the way, I don't know if I've used this with you before, but if I have 3 priorities and everyone at the next level has 3 priorities with those 3, and then everyone under them has 3 priorities, by the time you get 5 levels deep within an organization, that's over 2,000 priorities. And so when you begin to look at that and say, how do we actually decide what's the most important things and how do we create that investment in the right places, we needed some type of construct where we started talking about that. So in simple terms, this notion of impact really matters to us. Is there a substantial impact on a given activity? And then is it foundational in the sense that if that activity doesn't take place, something else can't take place, right? So you have to figure out a way to prioritize that. And so this has become a construct in which we've talked about setting different priorities. The priorities that we set, and each one of these bullets went through some of that construct. And remember, there's 2,000 or so different things in the background, but there's about, I think it's 9 different areas here. Ensuring Nebraskans are college, career, and civic ready. Very, very close to your mission. We have to absolutely be able to define college, career, and civic readiness. And there's a whole bunch of things here, including your civic readiness definition, that work is ongoing and we have to accomplish. But we've added other things, thinking about technical assistance, that thinks about how it helps college and career ready students. How do we take the tool sets that we build in career education, for instance, and make sure that they're available? How do we do that work? And so that work is ahead of us. And by the way, somewhat coincidentally, I suppose, at the bottom of that list, you will see review character education instruction per Nebraska revised statute 79-725. Senator Groney certainly mentioned 725. If you look at 726, it says the Commissioner of Education will outline and propose, based on his judgment, what character education, essentially curriculum and instruction, should look like. And so I highlight that because in statute it also says I'm supposed to go do that work, and I laid that out here because actually in the conversations around civic readiness, where we haven't maybe talked as much about that character education piece, I thought that was important. I'll take one other liberty. When we've had these challenges where in all around the state, where we've had challenges of students not respecting other students based on race or culture or poverty or anything along those lines, and we've had this hit the newspapers, guess what? Character education, civic awareness, readiness are all topics that matter to me, matter to us, that help us set the tone for what we expect in schools to be happening, how we ensure that our schools are places that actually treat students well and get that work accomplished. It's clear that we have to measure and track academic progress, right? I mean, this is maybe pretty straightforward in that sense, but the board's two kind of goals that are underneath that. But I said implementing your assessment vision, right? Implementing this vision that we've had here and continue to do that work. And we have a plan, in fact, on the agenda that's part of that effort relative to submitting something to the legislature, but also the ACT and other things are there. Leading and supporting educator effectiveness and reviewing that teacher equity plan, but also thinking about how we have that work accomplished, thinking about how that framework, how we actually build leaders in the future, how we do a lot of that work with post-secondary and others to ensure that we're developing and coordinating a whole bunch of the efforts that are important to that approach with educator effectiveness. Supporting quality instructional materials, and this list of items here comes from staff, and some of this comes from the board relative to we are going to develop that. We are going to provide leadership there, and I know it's these things seem a challenge as we have to keep looking for resources, but we're going to keep looking for resources to make sure that that's available and that we're able to provide that type of leadership. And I think I've heard that loud and clear from the board. How we think about leveraging our regulatory role, and some of this work, again, very proud to hear it coming through the various committees that we're going to review and revise rules 10, 11, and 84. There might be other things as well, but really thinking of how AQuest is the foundation of that particular work, ensuring that we're incorporating all those different tools and processes, but also thinking about how we leverage our authority to enhance relationships with ESUs, how we do that to ensure that the needs improvement schools are being served well, how we use Rule 10 to align accountability and accreditation more effectively. All of that is in various committee conversations taking place, but also within the work of the agency and the work of the staff across the agency. thinking about how we engage Nebraskans, and you know, we've talked about this notion of student engagement being also an important part of that, and how do we engage students, making sure that we have some standard processes. I think a couple great ideas have come out of building kind of a regular review of things and surveying folks to be engaged at that front. And kind of, we wrote it down there, customer satisfaction type of approach to that, right? Making sure that we're serving the folks that we're supposed to serve. And then most of the rest of these are really around the organization and organizing for quality and improvement and thinking about the restructuring. One of the specific goals was laying out the structure of the organization to make sure it met that. You know, I forgot to mention this. You'll notice I put like 3 dots at the bottom of that. It was my great idea here, and I forgot to mention it. All those dots that translate through and who's supposed to be working on it. So if those 3 deputies are wondering who's working on it, I have their name attached in code there. So, but we're all working on thinking about the organizational structure because we have to be really effective going forward. And we have a lot of changes taking place in the agency, and it's important that we complete that work and are able to move on. So critical right now, as you know, budget and alignment of that. We're changing the processes that we use for budget so it aligns with the types of priorities that the board has. And that's not an easy overnight type of process for us, but I know that the finance committee and their work, it'll help us communicate better that we're doing the right things and investing in the right things and thinking about that. And just so you know, and just in case you've forgotten it, we start our biennial budget process not for this legislative session, but for next, and we start that in January. And so we really have to keep moving and keep ahead of that so we can be thoughtful about what we need in the future. I think this is, you know, terribly important, and among the things that I've laid out with staff, that investing in our people and programs, but at the same point in time trying to measure and do evaluation of people and programs aligned with the expectations of the strategic plan is important. So we have work taking place on that front as well. And then really measuring our progress and setting our strategic plan and our baseline is important. And I actually, you know, think about these benchmarks and other things and this baseline that we want to set. I actually want to go ahead and kind of be able to stop here, take questions and come back to this and be able to have that a bit in the context. And I didn't plan to do this originally, but because of the conversation in the strategic planning committee this morning, I think it might be important to kind of put it in the context of that committee as well. And I didn't want to repeat myself, and you've already had enough from me for a moment. So, but I would kind of end there. I will have also a detailed written report. I didn't give you the detailed written report because sometimes me dropping 40 pages on you right at the meeting isn't helpful. A lot of this content and some of the things I said will appear in there, so you can use that in your evaluation of me and say, all right, Matt, I see this here. I know you told us this. What really happened? So there'll be some other things on that front. So yeah.
Does anyone have any questions, the commissioner? Rachel?
It's a lot.
I know.
So I guess my question is because you've loaded the report, so we've had a chance to, you know, take a look also and see it. Are you thinking you're going to hold part of this until the strategic planning committee, or move forward with some of these elements?
Either way, I guess I don't want to. I just was thinking that some of that I could talk about, and then.
It just, from my view, it seems like you're on a roll.
Have you ever?
And there's some
I didn't want to lose you
value
on.
to keep going, and then maybe the strategic planning committee kind of backs in a little bit. I don't know, Pat, what your thoughts are.
If you want to continue the conversation as far as what we talked about in strategic planning, I'm okay with that. And when it comes for strategic planning, if you've had some time to think a little bit and have another question, we can do that, or we can move on. So if that's okay.
I just didn't want to be repetitive, so I thought whichever way you want to go.
Yeah, if that's okay with.
goes on, man.
All right, if you want me to go on, I can go
Keep
on.
going.
All right.
Maureen
Yeah.
has a comment?
Yeah, well, I had thought about this, knowing that you would be sharing this with us today, that I'm one of those, I think you've all found out, I like to have a written copy in front of me to be able to digest a little bit more. And I'm hopeful, and President Tim, this is up to you. I'm hopeful that we could come back next month if we have some questions or
Oh,
things
yes.
that we
Certainly.
want to discuss, when we've
Yeah,
had
we
some
can
time
include
to
that in the
review
agenda
it.
someplace.
It's just a lot. I mean,
There's a
you
lot
are
of
on a
stuff there.
roll.
Yeah, I know, and I start to feel it after a while too, so.
But I know that there's a couple things in here that I have some questions on, and I'm not sure that today is really the time
Okay.
to put into
All right.
it. But
Yeah.
I would like to hear the rest of what you have to share.
Okay. You have people in time frames, I tell you.
Well, and and one of the things that makes it interesting, I mean, just a week ago, we're releasing data, not even a week ago, we're releasing data for the first time, and our time frames on how we want to think about how we get all these different data elements here, and so I wanted to share a little bit of, I think, what's coming together on that front, so you can also get a sense of, there are questions, and actually it would probably help for me to have some of that feedback from you in this format so I can provide you a little more detail or answer those types of questions. That's actually
Yeah.
better for me
Okay.
too.
John?
Just a quick comment, and I'll be very, very brief, Commissioner.
Hint, hint, I know.
But as we start moving forward with your assessment and evaluation, granted, we spoke before that we're going to have we are going to have a hybrid of subjective and objective,
Yeah.
with the objective being, if you will, metrics from
Yeah.
the strategic plan. So we're going to start rolling with that next month
Yeah.
in making that happen. So if you could be thinking about that also in regards to your presentation of data, that how we're going to present it.
Yeah, in fact, a bit of how he's going to describe some of this that happens to be on the education profile page as well. So, for instance, if you took on the very first thing around ACT, for instance, right? And so we just rolled with ACT for the first time. Actually, I'm going to back up just briefly. For the first time, as you look at our data, and we had data sources all over the place, all over the agency in a lot of different ways, and that it's frustrating even to me because it makes it really hard to be able to report those things out in the type of fashion that we would really ultimately want to be able to have. If you look across here, the concept that is coming together underneath the education profile is there actually would be ongoing data that's actually telling our story of our metrics that we have on the state board strategic plan. That those would not just be a one-time event, but things that are always available for the board to look at and the public to look at. And that becomes actually quite important, because if that's not automated, somebody spends a heck of a lot of time just trying to pull things together for the simple purposes of reporting. And in here, what we're actually trying to do is ensure that data, all those different data sources, are in one place. And that takes a lot of effort, and our team does amazing work on doing that. Part of the goals and part of other things that we've had together was to build the capacity to do that. So our data research and evaluation team that actually has to be able to pull that together. Our communications team now that actually is having to pull those things together. A lot of different elements that make that happen. So the vision for this is that basically those data elements are able to be reported constantly through our process, and I think that's an important part of that work.
Molly?
I'm curious about this. Can you go to the top of it again? When I'm a person, it says select a school or district, so I can actually look at each of those boxes, and can I disaggregate data for like a 10-year period to see what I've done and if it's making a difference? So you can do a longitudinal study in time, but what if I want to actually then see how I compare to other schools? Can I also do that? Because I know it says by school or by city, but is there a school report card that does state
Comparisons between places,
that
right?
has state results that I might say, well, I wonder how I'm doing, and I could put in called a filter and filter it by size or my needs improvement status, and then just maybe if someone's doing better than I am, it pops, and wouldn't it be cool if you could actually then say, what are you doing? And
Why don't I show you a couple
Yeah.
things that it does? It maybe doesn't do absolutely all of those things, but I wouldn't mind showing you a couple things
Yeah.
that give you a sense of it, yeah.
so I guess I'm saying, wouldn't it be cool if it was
Yeah.
a learning tool, sharing
Yeah.
tool as well?
And that's what we hope for, yes.
I would just like to say, for those of us who have used the resource of the former school report card and the data, and where this is transitioned to, I think really accolades go to everyone in the department, because this has come
Long way.
a long way.
Oh, yes.
And I think that's a credit to everyone there. So if you used the system before and you see, it may not have everything there, it may not have every filter you
Yeah.
want, and every, but
But it's
this
a
is
dynamic
huge
opportunity,
change.
right?
That's
Yeah.
a huge change, absolutely.
Cool.
And,
Commissioner?
and as we go, and there, you know, the reality is there's always limitations in creating these displays, but I'm asking our team to be able to customize displays for specifically for our strategic plan, right? So it's always part of that work. But I'll take on, I'll go to the ACT side of this and look at ACT results, because here we are just rolling this out for the first time. And so Molly, I think to your point, the reality for a schools to compare one another to, you know, in a system, this may have some of the limitations. It doesn't do all of that. There are all of the data elements that are in here that are able to be downloaded, and so we continue to add tool sets to this, and I think that's also an important part of that process. So here, you know, if you go down and you click on ACT detail, and you can look at, and this is for statewide, so I'm just gonna look at statewide data. You can look at our English language results. You can go through it and you can see by our performance by subgroup. You can see all students. You can see male, female. You can see by American Indian through Native Americans, or excuse me, Native Hawaiian students, Pacific Islanders, Hispanic. And you can see as you go through that, that just visually there's different gaps. But when you also come down, you can look at bar graphs that actually look at the performance of all those subgroups. And so when you look at our American Indian subgroup students here, and you see that, oh my, 83% below proficient, right? And there's been a lot of attention to how many students are actually college and career ready, and ACT is truly not everything. I mean, I'm not even ever trying to say that, but what we are able to start to point out is that we have substantial gaps, and we have not yet, as a board, set a baseline on where we want that to go, because this was the first year. This is our baseline for ACT, right? So looking at the different subgroups. I mean, you look at, I'll look at special education, right? That we have 87% of our special ed students not proficient on ACT. We've set a very high bar, right, on this notion of college and career ready underneath the ACT benchmark, and it's our bar to continue to work with schools and students to be able to overcome that bar, to be ready. And we have other metrics and measures that I think we have to be there, but we have to decide what our number one, this is our baseline, I guess. I mean, I think we know this is our baseline, but we have to decide where we want it to go in the future. Yeah.
And this baseline, though, is only the ACT
this
benchmark
one's
right
only
now.
ACT.
So have you put in yet our
This one's proficient.
cut
This one's
for-
actually, this one has
This
that
is
cut.
proficient,
Yes.
so
Yep,
it's
I'm sorry, yeah.
the combined
Yeah.
on track
Yes,
and
yes,
ACT. Okay.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for that clarification.
thanks.
Maureen,
the-
did you have a question?
I don't know if this is really necessary at this point, but have you had a lot of reaction from administrators as to their surprise at where they are with this?
Not
Especially because you've got pilot schools,
Mhm.
so they already have
I
some
don't think so
information.
much from a surprise from schools' perspective. I think a bit more surprise from the general public perspective and others that, you know, and I found it interesting because I've had a few emails where folks go, well, hey, Department of Education, you know, what are you doing about this? And I come back to my knowing something. You know, I said, number one, we administered the statewide assessment. By the way, we had gaps underneath NISA tests at high school as well, right? These are not, you know, we changed the bar, which changes maybe the percent, but we had gaps before. How are we organizing to actually do something? When I look at ACT, and when I look at what this means for us as a state, we've had to spend a lot of time and energy getting credibility around the measures and metrics that we were using with just a high school state test, right? We had to spend a lot of time doing the assessment science part of that. ACT is expensive, I mean, relative to maybe other ways that we've done this, but it's also creating a bit of, I think where everyone at least believes the results, right? They don't question whether or not those results are there. Now, they might question how you use those results, and I think that's always an appropriate conversation for us. But as far as the assessment itself, it's well-grounded and it's meaningful. Our challenge is ensuring that students then are prepared to be successful by the time they get to high school, to be successful. And so all the way through. So when you look at, and this, you can look at then data by year, for instance. I'll try to go back to another view here just for a moment, so I can look at, you know, the NISA data. So that's also here, and you can.
Are we gonna call it
Oh, you had to ask me that question. Nebraska Student-Centered Assessment System.
SCAS,
Yeah.
NSCAS,
By the way,
right?
we looked at a lot of different names and then ended up
Nequist.
not being as creative as we. All those creative names were taken as a
I think they're
term.
called NSCAS. Are you gonna change that to NSCAS? I mean.
Yeah, so this is still NISA though,
Last
right?
year, yeah,
This is
yeah.
still based on that NISA.
NSCAS.
So you can in here, you can dive in and start to look at, you know, pick it, and I'll just look at
8th grade.
8th grade for a moment. So you can see the same type of data and the percent below proficient and proficient, and then all of our different benchmarks that come into play. And we look at that performance of subgroups again, and you go, hey, how are we doing on this, and how are we looking at that and in a given year? You can also look at this over a period of years as well. So you know, my basic point is you can dive in and look at these things. What I want, though, is to ensure that we have data reports by the goals that we had. Now, we had to be able to roll with this system for a lot of other reasons. We have other reasons we have to report, you know, from a federal level and other fronts too. But it becomes important that we're able to do that. I know graduation rate is the other kind of example where I wanted to highlight, because among your goals was graduation, and we said that 95% for everyone and 90% for any one subgroup. And so you get in here and you look at our overall graduation rate, and remember we had a 7-year cohort, and so you can look back at certain years. And so our 7-year cohort, for the only group that would have been possible would have been our 2014 group, right? So we're actually to 2017. Looking at that, they're at 93.42. Well, we want an overall state rate of 95%, right? But we also wanted every subgroup to be over 90%. So among Hispanic students, for instance, across the state, we're at 88.51, which you might say, okay, good, I think we can get Hispanic to that level. You look at African American students. Are we doing as well? We're a little bit not doing quite as well on that front. How are we going to keep moving that? How does knowing something help us do something, right? And so it's beyond just the reports on the metrics, but what our expectations are to be able to move those metrics, not just from here, but with schools. So we have to use our regulatory role. We have to use our school improvement processes. We have to use leadership in our assessment system to try to keep moving those things forward. And we have to be able to communicate those to schools. So they're our partners in that effort.
I just have a question relating to, let's say I'm a school district and I'm looking at this and I have a high population that shows low proficiency. On this website, are we going to have embedded a virtual link that shows schools? You could take an ACT student, and I know they do this with SAT, and they take the score and they can see where the virtual repository can tap in to provide individual learning plans, and like Khan Academy and stuff like that. That's free, no money involved. Or is that going to be like a corollary arm in the future?
So part of our work, it wouldn't necessarily be in the
Yeah.
reporting system, but our work of aligning student data to what they're actually looking at our reports, and actually providing those things based on, hey, look, this student seems to be struggling in this area, that there would be those resources available to that particular student. Personal learning plans, other
Yeah.
things, yes. I
That
mean,
would be
that's
really
the
cool
hope.
if your report also was correlated with an avenue for the school district to provide needed resources and opportunities for students to bring up their proficiency level on an individualized basis.
Rachel?
I was just gonna say, I think that's where the, some of the tools that are kind of out there and that are moving forward, if you look at Ed Ready with ACT, and if you look at the online test prep kinds of things, many of those tools are already correlated to the individual student result. And I think that's what's important. You know, for us to take a lot of time and energy to create it as a group may not be as effective as understanding those tools that are out there to help the individual student. So, you know, there's a investment and time perspective that I think is important to consider in that process. And it just seems to me some of those kinds of strategies should really be continue to be focused for that individual student level, and then create other just general resources.
Kind of local control, but as long as they know you're making the reports, here's some opportunities, and then they can seek those out. And the NROC is good too.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we should give the commissioner a break out there and
Bring
catch
a
his
break,
breath.
yeah, right.
And we'll move on with some of the rest of our agenda, and then, okay. I'll wait till you get up here, and then you can answer whether we have anything changing on the consent agenda or whatever.
We don't, well, it's
Or
not the consent
not
agenda,
today,
it's just
today we don't, yeah,
we do have
the
reports,
process.
yeah.
There we go. You were timed out.
All right, so I do have the report on rules on there, and I think that's,
Okay.
you'll see that in your document. We got Rule 15 and Rule 23 up for, or that have had public hearings, and then we still are waiting on Rule 71 and 72 to be approved by the governor, so that report's attached in there.
Okay. Okay.
And Ryan, if he is.
Yeah, Ryan, we're ready for you for board policy research and the report on ad hoc committees.
Last month and maybe the month before, there was some conversation about previous study committee reports and some of the work of that and recalling some of that work. And so for your information, I've uploaded 3 of those recent study committee reports for your review as you're thinking about work coming forward in the next year, other pieces from that work that may be important to continue thinking about. One of them is with respect to early childhood education. Second one is with respect to career education, and the staff have included progress in that report. There were some directives to staff specifically in that one. And the third one was on competency-based education. And so we've placed those there simply as a point of information for you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ryan. We'll move to standing committee reports. Maureen, please report on the AQuest teaching and learning domain.
The Teaching and Learning Committee met with 3 proposed action items on the agenda for tomorrow. The first one was on civic readiness, and the committee discussed wanting to take action this month on the second draft of the definition of civic readiness. The committee is pursuing this item from a goal in the strategic vision and direction. Quote, by 2018, the state board will adopt a comprehensive approach to define and measure civic readiness, unquote. We have asked staff to share more information about the process of the development of the definition. So Corey and Harris.
Sit there, I'll drive.
You drive? Okay, yeah, you drive.
Told Harris I'll drive the computer, so. Well, good afternoon. For the record, I'm Corey Epler, Chief Academic Officer.
I'm Harris Payne, the social studies specialist.
Wanted to talk a little bit about the document that's in the agenda that's referencing the process that got us to this point relative to a definition, proposed definition for civic readiness. And so I thought it would be important for us to really be grounded in that idea of how we got to this point, how the definition, proposed definition would be used, and what we see moving forward. So as mentioned earlier, the driver behind this work was the adoption of the state board's strategic vision and direction a year ago. That included the goal that Maureen mentioned, so a comprehensive approach to define and measure civic readiness. And so the work around defining civic readiness is what we've really been focused on over the last, I would say, 10 months or so, relative to really clarifying what is meant by the phrase civic readiness. I thought it was also important to note that there were bills introduced in the 2016 and 2017 legislature that would propose legislation that would require the successful completion of a civics examination as a prerequisite for high school graduation. In 2016, the state board was neutral. There were not stances taken on the two bills last year. However, the state board did support the amendment to LB 14 and provided testimony to the education committee. I linked the amendment summary from information from the board from earlier this year. About that same time, we further we're really trying to clarify again, what do we mean by civic readiness? And the board and Teaching and Learning Domain Committee had good conversation with Senator Christ around the expectations relative to what I would say is not just civics knowledge, but social studies. Because I think that's something that we've held as important as referencing social studies encompasses history, geography, economics, as well as civics. So wanting to make sure that we just don't focus in on civics because there's other pieces that ultimately inform the civic readiness idea that we've talked a lot about. So we hosted a social studies summit in February. We invited educators and stakeholders from across Nebraska. The list of summit attendees is included in the agenda. And really the key questions that we were working around in that particular activity was thinking specifically about skills, knowledge, and dispositions that are crucial for citizens, evidence that we could collect that would serve as a signal that schools have taught and students have learned about civic competence. What can a society reasonably expect civically competent people to know and be able to do, and how can it be measured? And again, at the result of that, 3 strategies were recommended. We presented those to the state board in March 2017, and those strategies are also uploaded as an additional document as well. And from there, we sought volunteers to work on the action plan associated with each of the strategies. And again, we invited people to participate. I think, as much as we invite, sometimes people don't accept our invitation, and that's okay. So we ran with those that were willing to do extra work, and I attached the work group members from that conversation as well. And then between March and August, the draft was written. And the question that we heard earlier today was who wrote it? And you can't put a single name beside it. If any of you have participated in group wordsmithing, that's sometimes a cumbersome process, but it really was a collective effort of multiple voices, and there is not one person that we said wrote this definition. It was truly a collective effort that began with the over 60 participants that participated last February. We asked for stakeholders to review that. And then in October, per the suggestion of the Teaching and Learning Domain Committee, we targeted specific organizations and individuals to provide us additional feedback. And I included the list of individuals that we contacted. And again, you'll see that we had some response, and though some did not respond. And again, we specifically reached out to those individuals per the suggestion of the committee. The agenda item was for approval relative to the definition of civic readiness. One of the things that I really want to be clear on, and I'll take some ownership that I wish I would have had this conversation a couple months ago, and because I think there's still some confusion around how this definition will be used. This definition does not replace or amend Nebraska's social studies standards. Those standards are required by law, and per Rule 10, we know that schools have to develop curriculum that is aligned to Nebraska's social studies standards. And again, those strands within the standards include civics, history, economics, and geography. There's some confusion around the timeline, and our content area standards revision timeline hasn't changed. It's been posted for several years at this point. Social studies hasn't changed, I should say. A couple of the other areas we've revised. Following the 7-year statutory requirement for review of those standards, the process to revise Nebraska's social studies standards begins in 2019. We typically give ourselves about a year to get that process done, and we anticipate fall of 2020 is when we would bring a set of standards to the board for approval. So I think, again, there's a misunderstanding that this work is happening because standards are being revised, and I'll reiterate that this work is happening because of the State Board's strategic vision and direction from a year ago that asked us to clarify and define civic readiness. The definition does align with the requirements in Nebraska Revised Statutes 79-724, and we feel like it does serve as an additional strategy that allows schools to promote civic education, character education, and community engagement. One thing, too, that I think is important to understand is that this process is not new to a State Board of Education. In 2010, the State Board adopted the definition for career readiness. And the process that we use to develop the definition for career readiness is very similar to the process that we use to develop the definition for civic readiness. And we've had that definition in place, gosh, almost 7 years now at this point. And if by providing that definition of career readiness, it's allowed us to create resources, provide professional learning, and additional supports as schools work towards intentionality of career readiness of all students. So we see this definition as similar in nature, that again, it allows us to really create resources and provide additional support around what this board believes civic readiness is. The other thing that I think is really exciting about the definition is that, we talk a lot about interdisciplinary teaching and learning and how we can continue to make content relevant and do it in an authentic manner. And so I think, if anything, this definition broadens the opportunities for students to experience civic readiness instruction and activities. And I put in a few examples, and these came from our content area specialist. I don't have all of them because I, again, just did a few about a day ago. And this would show how civic readiness activities would be included in social studies, family and consumer science, business marketing and management. You can see the other content areas as well. So if anything, it really, we hope, broadens the scope of who ultimately is providing support relative to civic readiness. So I think that shifts all of the burden from social studies educators, because civic readiness isn't just the sole responsibility of social studies teachers. And I say the same thing about career readiness, is career readiness isn't just the responsibility of school counselors or CTE teachers. All educators have an opportunity to provide that level of support for students. So these are a few examples of how we see this definition fitting in with other content areas. The other piece I'll mention is that we have some really great expanded learning opportunities that the department supports. A specific example are career and technical student organizations, so FFA, DECA, FCCLA. They're already doing a lot of activities that encourage civic readiness, but again, this creates a structure for it. So they're able to continue to align those activities and develop new activities that would support the definition. I also see expanded learning programs, so before school, after school, and summer programs, really being able to use this definition just to guide how they develop resources and experiences. So again, saying that all educators in our system have the responsibility of helping students become civic ready as defined by the state board. Our plans moving forward with the definition, once it's approved, is a big piece of that is professional learning. So really providing the appropriate support for educators, working with our service units, working with teacher preparation to provide the appropriate support so that schools are able to provide that opportunity for students. It'll help frame the resources that we develop and curate. It's not all just about development of resources. There are a lot of great digital resources out there that we can ensure are aligned with our social studies standards and also aligned with our vision for civic readiness. And then I think that moving forward there will be a conversation around accountability for schools relative to the definition. We've had some conversations in committee about what would an item in the evidence-based analysis look like, specifically towards and around civic readiness. But I think we heard a good example today from Senator Groney around voting, around additional ways that we might consider looking at the accountability piece of that, because the secondary part of that goal is to define, but also to identify a comprehensive approach to defining it. I think that's really critical, is the comprehensive approach to defining it. So there is a tremendous amount of excitement from our schools. Similar to when the board approved career readiness, the school said thank you, because then they're able to really put a frame around what they're working to do to support that, and same thing with us. So I will stop there relative to explaining the process of how we got there and how we see it being used in our plans for moving forward.
Thank you. Maureen?
Board members, any questions?
One of the confusions that
Microphone.
There we go. One of the confusions, I think, in the public was explained in the committee, and if I don't know, Harris or Corey, about people not understanding that we are following 79, 724 and 25, but in regard to Rule 10 standards, can you kind of fill them in so that they understand that we do cover those, and that the definition, which you just explained so well, just is an assistant aid to getting those things done?
Well, and I will say the foundation rests within the K-12 Nebraska social studies standards. And solid instruction relative to K-12 social studies education. I think it was in 2015, I had that document on my desk where we did an alignment between the social studies standards and the Americanism statute, and have that documentation of which standards ultimately support what is in the statute. There are also at least 2 or 3 references to that particular statute in Rule 10. So again, it's through that curricular piece. So, you know, we shared this last year in terms of the proposed legislation, that solid instruction in the social studies really is central to this. And we think that that's really critical and important. So, and then ensuring through our processes at the agency that the standards are being met, that they're being taught with fidelity, is something that's important too. Anything you might add, Harris?
No, I think Corey covered it very well, that, you know, indeed we have prepared a document in the past showing the correlation between 79, 724 and our social studies standards. During the development process of those standards, that was very conscious. And even when I went out the first year and schools looked at the new standards and did the document, 79, 724 was something I gave them every single time to read, so they read through it. Because I wanted to make sure that it is the law, and they need to know that that's the law, and that that's reflected in the standards.
And I think, thank you for that, because I think sometimes people outside the education realm thought that those statutes should be in here, and it's totally like what you just explained. It's already in the standards in Rule 10.
Rachel? Thank you, and I appreciate, again, the background information and the discussion that we've had at the committee level and the discussion at the full board level, that really, you know, sometimes the disadvantage of a committee is we don't necessarily get the voice of all board members, and that's what this opportunity is. And so there is an opportunity, you know, with the additional input that's been provided and the looking through a different lens, to take the time. This isn't something that, you know, though we set the goal as part of our strategic plan, you know, we control that goal and we control that timeline. And I think from the perspective of the committee, we value all the work that's been done to date, but there isn't any reason that we can't take some additional time and make sure the voice of every board member and some of the thoughts and reflecting on that process is incorporated in the discussion at the committee level and incorporated as it comes to the full board.
Maureen, does the committee have a recommendation?
Yes. The committee, considering recent feedback and input, the committee recommends sending the definition back to the staff to review and bring forward a draft to the committee for the January meeting, and pulling this item from the business agenda for tomorrow.
Okay, does anyone have any questions regarding that? Okay. Anything else on this? Holly?
I just wanted to thank you. This is such an important part of what we all do in K-12 education. And I was impressed that Senator Groney came, and we're working with the legislature, not taking, it's not like we're supplanting their authority, we're working with them, and I'd be in favor of waiting a month. I also think it is really interesting, just the idea of another evidence-based analysis, even registration to vote, and why it's important. And he was talking about holding public office, so I think that his suggestions are well appreciated. And I do know that you did make a huge attempt to have a cross-section of citizens across the whole state, so thank you.
Patrick?
I just appreciate the fact that we're going to postpone this and look at it again. I think the real issue comes down to what we do has several audiences. One of the audiences is the folks, you folks here in the staff, and the folks that have contributed, and the other audience is the public in general. And I think we always got to be cognizant of what the public in general hears and sees, and, you know, be able to explain what we're doing so that the public understands what we're doing. And, you know, sometimes I kind of fall out there in the public, I guess, rather than on the board on some of these issues. But I really do think communication it's important to get the communication from everybody that we can, and it's equally important to get that communication out there as to why we're doing it, what we're doing it for. Mm-hmm. You know, how many people have heard, well, this is part of the strategic plan, other than the people on this board and right here in the department? How many people understand what the real goals of the strategic plan are? Mm-hmm. So, you know, we've got to do a better job of communicating with the public about why we're doing what we're doing and what we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Maureen, next.
Pat, I would just like to add two pieces that I really appreciated in this report, Corey and Harris, that you talked about the other content areas besides social studies and civics education, because it is interdisciplinary. It is across the curriculum that we need to be incorporating all of these things in simple, easy ways. So I think that's really important. And one last piece is, I just want to give a huge shout out to the committee, Pat Tim and Rachel Wise and Lisa Fricke. Patrick, they are very caring and want to ensure that the public, what we are hearing, is listened to. And I want you to be assured of that, and I want the public to be assured of that as well.
Okay.
That this was a great conversation earlier today and last month as well. So.
Okay.
I might just add, you know, from time to time, we have these things come forward, and unfortunately, members of not everybody is able to participate in those committee opportunities. So, I think that, sharing it with the board is part of the process where some of us who haven't been able to participate can have our word. So when we start rushing things sometimes, when we move things too fast, again, the public has a different perception of why we might be doing it, but it also doesn't always give us us who are not on that particular committee, an opportunity to have a voice before you really move ahead with it. So, thank you.
All right. Do you have
Thank you,
other
Corey
things?
and Harris.
Thank you.
Yep.
Do you have other
Thank
things?
you.
Okay, and also, the Teaching and Learning Committee, we had an assessment report. The committee reviewed a second draft of the Department of Ed's summative assessment administration and reporting plan and technical reports. This report is to be filed with the Nebraska legislature. The committee has asked staff to share information on the changes that were made to the draft in the last month. And so Valerie and Jeremy, would you please come up and share? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Valerie Foy. I'm Director of Statewide Assessment.
Jeremy Henniger, Assistant Director of Statewide Assessment.
And we really worked back and forth on this report a lot, so we're both here in case you have questions that the other one could better answer. So the changes in the report since last month are based around these pieces. When I came in, Jeremy and I presented the report, I provided information about why I did 3 years of reporting and what changes assessment had gone through, names of the testing, the performance levels and pieces like that. And the Teaching and Learning Committee had asked me to prepare a preface, if you will, that encapsulated those changes about why we put 3 years of reports here and the changes that we have gone through in assessment in the last 3 years. So the introduction is really a written documentation of the presentation that I did about that last month. Okay. We were also asked to take the acronyms out. We had ITBS as one of our tests, and that's the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, but we totally understand that that's a little mind-boggling, when you get a lot of those in there, and so we changed there's no acronym in here that doesn't have an explanation for it. When we say the Nebraska Student-Centered Assessment System, NSCAS, I do indicate that that's NSCAS, and I don't write it out every time, but everything has an explanation. Good. And then finally, in the report on the comparability with national assessment instruments, there were just a few places that we had asterisked where the value did drop below a 0.70 correlation, and it was because the number was so small. When a number is so small, it's just not reliable when you're trying to do a correlation with it. And we had 2 places that happened, and we added a comment that if the correlations drop below or less than 0.70, the small sample size of the students who participated in that grade would need to be taken in account. And then I clarified and spoke right up to the example up in the draft, or up in the chart. It says, for example, grade 4 only had 84 students who participated in the Terra Nova. And that's a really low number to try to do a correlation on anywhere. We only had 2 places that happened, and in both cases it was that very low number that affected that. And so those were the clarifications that we added to this, or changes that we made in this.
Board members, any questions for Valerie or Jeremy?
Do you have a recommendation from the committee?
Seeing none, the committee recommends approving this report tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you. We have one more action item for tomorrow. The committee reviewed revisions to Rule 23, Basic Skills Competency Testing of Teachers and Administrators. The recommendation is to adjust the composite score requirements of the core skills test. And we've asked Kevin Peters to share a bit more information on this to clarify.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Peters, Director of Teacher Certification. We've been studying and hearing from people that core is a barrier to getting into the teacher education program for a number of years. We asked the colleges about it, and they found that they didn't really have that data because a person would go out and take the test but not yet have been registered in teacher ed because they didn't get a passing score. So we went back to ETS and we asked for a couple representative schools for data in the last 4 years of how many people did not pass the test, not wanting the data of those that did pass the test. And in that data, we found out we're missing a lot of students. The one school that was represented had 51 failing ones. If we went to a composite of the total, 24 of those students would be able to start right now without retaking the test. The other school, a larger school, had 227 students that failed over the 4-year period, and of that, 93 of those students could immediately start based on their scores. A lot of students miss this passing ratio by 2 points or 5 points, and they take it repetitively, and that's about where they set. But if they were able to, with using the composite, use a little bit of points from one test to help out on another test, we'd have a significant amount of students that could enroll in teacher ed in their junior year of college. So we ask that you help to increase that supply and give these students a chance.
Any questions from board members? Seeing none, the committee recommends approving this report tomorrow.
Thank you.
Madam President, that concludes my report.
All right, thank you. Molly, will you please report on success and access domain?
All right, we'll move right into the first action item, and this is to authorize the commissioner to contract with Heather Robbins. She's behavioral support services for the purposes and supports around special education and MTSS in needs improvement and priority schools for the period from November 6th through 2017 through October 31st, 2018. Okay, and our committee voted to, we unanimously supported to send this forward. And I guess all I was going to say about this is Heather's independent, and she supplies this need and the credentials. And if you've heard of PBIS, it's the Positive Behavioral Instructional Support, and she has very solid background experiences. Are there any questions? All right, well then we'll move on. I love following Maureen. You're all ready to keep going after this. This is good. All right, let's go to 4.2, 8.2, adopt proposed revisions to Rule 15. And this is regulations, procedures for education of students with limited English proficiency in public schools. Basically, the Rule 5 is the rule is 5 years old, and we had to do review and updates. Part of the revisions address terminology. The English language learner is going to now be called the English learner, and not. They kind of transition a lot, but now it's going to be English learners, and it aligns with Rule 10, and no changes were requested from stakeholders, and no concerns were identified at the public hearing. And it's noted that English learners are 7% of our student population. And also we're going to keep them after they exit out of our system. We'll watch them 4 years instead of 3. Okay, all right. Any questions? All right, well, that will come to you tomorrow. And our next action item is 4.2.B.1, and this is to grant the commissioner authority to approve the contract with the issue 13, and that's in western Nebraska, for those of you not familiar with it, Scottsbluff area, to develop innovative programs across the state to educate Nebraska VR staff, educators and family members, and implement effective strategies that increase independent living and inclusion for students with disabilities in their communities and competitive, integrated workplaces. And we have our own deputy commissioner here. Mark, I don't know if they have any questions, but what's kind of cool about this is they're going to supply toolkits for the teachers and parents. And the funds of the contract are available, four from the federal government, just to one from the state. So it's very economical. And Pat did ask to include source of funding for contracts and grants in the future. So whenever something comes to either of our domains, that's a good thing for 2018 to remember, to make sure we talk about what the source of funding and what the proportions are. We did all move to forward this to the work session, and in a conversation with Mark later, it really reinforced my opinion that our students that are in vocational rehabilitation are such viable members of our state and provide such valuable resources. So this independent living is huge. Any questions? All right, then I am done. Thank you.
Thank you. I will report on the policy committee meeting. At last month's meeting, we did tell you that we would be voting on the 2018 State Board meeting dates. And Ryan briefed us on a proposal from the Legislative Committee that we generally have in January. In addition to our January meeting, we have a retreat on legislation that was scheduled for January 22nd. And the Legislative Committee has asked that that date be withdrawn and that we talk about legislation after our business meeting on February 2nd. This is not a long length of time, and the reasoning was that it will give staff more time to look at what is happening in the legislature and give them more time to do some research and prepare. There still will be the opportunity for the commissioner and staff to come to the Legislative Committee if they have questions about recommendations, that something may come up before then. And also the president and vice president are involved in that discussion. The committee is certainly in agreement with that and would like to move forward with leaving that or putting that on the afternoon of February 2nd. That meeting is already scheduled, so we don't need to do anything in addition. There was some discussion of leaving a placeholder for the 26th or the 22nd, just in case it's needed. If it's not needed, then it's just erased from the calendar. So, Rachel?
Pat, if we could put on the calendar the February 2nd, add a state board legislative retreat so it's clear and we don't lose sight that that's not a part of the business meeting, that would be a separate meeting. I think that way we won't lose sight that the intent is to have
Okay. We talked about that. Scott, do you want to?
We could do it that way. I told them that they,
We did talk about that, and I'll have Scott give his reasoning, and then.
we could do it that way as like a parenthetical for, as you said, purposes of reminding. Simply for the purposes of compliance with the Open Meetings Act, I said we'll have an agenda out there that will have the business meeting, and that could be essentially part of the business meeting. So, but I understand your point, and they could do it. I just told them they need not say, oh, and it's also a legislative retreat.
Right, I think the intent was it to be a separate legislative retreat, not necessarily built into the structure of the business meeting. So, such as in the past when we've had the legislative retreat, it really creates that conversational structure and process. So I think that was the intent of the committee, and by all means, committee, let me know if you have a different view. So I think there could be some value, so we build that as a separate work session retreat as opposed to build it within the agenda of the business meeting. Okay.
I'd agree with that, and only forsake that, our Friday meetings tend to be, how soon can we get out of here sometimes? And I think to have that as a separate retreat probably makes more sense, because then I think we'll feel less urgency or have less reason to expect the urgency to end the meeting early just by flying through what would otherwise be part of the retreat.
Okay. So we'll be voting on this tomorrow, and are we going to take the
Yeah.
Molly?
I was just going to say, it's February 2nd, by the way, and if in fact we have it following our regular business meeting, we'll probably have lunch together. So if we did finish at 10:30, we could start the legislative meeting at 11 and then have lunch. We wouldn't have to wait till 1 to start. That would be my only comment about having it as an integrity with the meeting day, for people that have to travel long distances.
Lisa?
In the committee discussion, for the January 22nd, you're going to put in parentheses something that is a
if it's needed.
If it's needed.
If
Yeah,
it's needed,
and that's
because
still the case, right?
It's a lot easier to cancel a meeting than it is to advertise and make sure that we're within the time frames of adding a meeting. And so that's just a placeholder. I think everyone is in agreement that moving forward with the 2nd of February is a great idea. And, you know, it's up to all of you as to how that is phrased tomorrow. Pat?
I don't want to take anything away from the chairman of the legislative committee, but this is all part, I think, of a relook at how we're going to do, how the legislative committee is going to be doing things in the future. And this is just part of that process that will, I think, in the long run, make the legislative committee much more proactive. And I'll let Rachel worry about speaking more to that issue when she gives her report.
Okay, thank you. All right, we will move on to the legislative committee. Rachel?
Well, Patrick just teed it up, so there you go.
Great transition.
We do have a transition report, and we did discuss, as Patrick just said, it does reflect the work over the past year and reflects some recommendations and some thoughts moving forward. And much of the discussion was around making some changes that maybe better align the use of time and personnel in our thoughtfulness around legislation, which led to our discussion on changing the date. One, so that staff has the time to pull together the information that we use. Two, to just streamline our time. We're coming the 1st and 2nd anyway. It makes sense, as opposed to add an additional meeting, to go ahead and add it on to the time schedule that we have. And so those are some of the discussions. And then, as Patrick said, we are not at this time recommending from a legislative committee to do a special activity with our legislators or host an activity, but to really encourage, as one of our recommendations for work moving forward for the legislative committee going forward, to really look at what's our best strategies to reach out and to network with our partners in the legislature to be more effective in those processes, as Patrick said earlier. And so that was a lot of our discussion as a part of that committee report. But for today, we've got 2 reports in your file that we want to spend a little bit of time on. And so I'm going to ask Brian to come forward, because he's going to walk through these reports with all of us. The first report is the Carryover 2017 legislation. And that report, as Brian goes through it, will give an update on some of the things that have happened in the interim with staff and working on some of the carryover bills that are there and what the status might be. And there is no action that we're proposing going forward with that particular item. The second item then that Brian will walk through are the legislative and regulatory priorities that really is a different type of public summary of work, so to speak, from the legislative committee that we would like to review and discuss today and then bring back in January for a formal adoption of those regulatory and legislative priorities, really, that would then be for 2018. So Brian, if you want to start walking through our first document of the carryover legislation.
I certainly will. Good afternoon. Brian Halstead, Deputy Commissioner, Chief of Staff for Operations. The committee has first of all, has been working hard throughout the year. Even though the Nebraska legislature may have adjourned last May, this committee's been working very hard on a whole number of items. One of the things the committee was interested in is the positions that the state board took in 2017, which are all still the positions of the state board. There were several bills, though, that they felt should be continued and talked about to remind people of work that's been going on since that time. LB 347 was a bill that Senator Geist introduced on behalf of the governor to eliminate from statutes an unneeded bus permit that has to be done. We at the department were supportive of that and worked with the Department of Motor Vehicles on that bill. That bill did not get on the agenda for discussion. It's sitting on general file. Since the session has ended, we at the department have continued conversations with the Nebraska Safety Center, the transportation directors for school districts, about changes in Rule 91 that would need to occur, and we're certainly prepared to bring forward Rule 91 with changes in it to make sure that the drivers of motor vehicles that have children in them in our schools have met the safety requirements, are competent to be driving those. So that's the work the staff has been doing since that time. We certainly are hopeful that this bill will get up in this session to be done, because what the Department of Motor Vehicles has to currently do is really not needed anymore, and it would help better streamline processes and remove outdated statutes that no longer accomplish anything. So the committee wanted to reemphasize our support for getting rid of outdated statutes, and this is a Department of Motor Vehicles request, so we're certainly hopeful and supportive that the governor and the legislature will get this done when they come back in January. Following that same line, LB 377 was a bill you supported that cleans up outdated statutes related to the 6 classes of school districts the legislature adopted in 1949 when there were over 5,000 school districts in this state. As you're all well aware, there are no Class 1 school districts, elementary only, nor high school districts, Class 6 anymore in this state. They've been gone for over a decade. And the bill also makes Class 2 school districts who have a number of inhabitants less than 1,000 just be Class 3 school districts. The bill was written so that it could take effect in 2017 because that was a non-election year cycle. Staff has worked with the Education Committee to have an amendment offered because we're already in the election cycle for 2018, so the implementation of this bill, should it get enacted, would be January 1st of 2019. And again, it would eliminate a lot of outdated statutes. It also would streamline and correct references and a number of others. So that work has been going on. LB 651, I think you all remember from last session, it was a bill that Senator Linehan introduced about 3rd grade retention if a child isn't on grade level in reading. This board opposed it. There has been work that has gone on. I know the commissioner, myself, and Mr. McPherson have met with Senator Linehan. But the legislative committee asked itself about, well, how has the board legislated for rules on addressing reading instruction, mathematics instruction, and intervention services for students who aren't on grade level? That is part of your strategic vision and direction that by 2020 all elementary schools will have intervention-based services available for students who are not on grade level. So the committee first went through all of the NDE rules, identifying where there's some authority where the board has spoken on the subject of reading or mathematics. As you can see, staff prepared draft language that the committee reviewed in September. There was additional edits to that. The committee, if you remember back in October, reported to this full board about how they had approved that language moving forward. So when rule revision occurs, the commissioner should be incorporating that language into the rules that are identified. Rule 10, accreditation of schools. Rule 11, early childhood education. Rule 24, endorsements for the teacher colleges as to how well prepared are teachers in early childhood education and elementary education to address and know strategies and theories for improving reading and mathematics, along with Rule 51, incorporating the concepts of dealing with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So again, the board's still opposed to third grade retention and that simple tool to utilize, but there's more work going forward on all of that.
And on this particular, I really want to commend my colleagues who are on the committee, Maureen, Molly, and Pat. We've spent quite a bit of time, and all the time the staff took to do this analysis. I think this bill served as a catalyst for us. I'm not sure inspired is the best word, but maybe inspired, but catalyst truly to have us examine our own processes. And I think this was a reminder to us, are we using our regulatory authority effectively in some of these areas? And this certainly was a catalyst, and I want to thank my colleagues in the department and all the time it took on this particular item.
And again, going back, LB 14 is still sitting there. It was mentioned by Senator Groney. It came up in earlier conversations. You've already had a good discussion on a definition of civic readiness and the work you're continuing to do. In that regard, it's just a reminder that this work is ongoing. The legislature will be convening. You have supported the amendment. And as Senator Groney, I think in it, he's open to changes in that amendment, and we're willing to work with him and the members of the Education Committee on moving that bill forward with language that actually updates the need to know the basic knowledge and facts about our form of government and everything. So that's an ongoing discussion. And the last bill that's listed here is LB 511. It deals with the statutes that deal with the education of state wards and how that's all handled. You supported that bill, and it was introduced by the Education Committee. We asked the committee to hold that because there was more work going on. Since that time, staff and leadership from the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Office of Probation have had monthly meetings on how we can improve processes and also make changes to 79-215 to better address the needs of students who find themselves in either the child welfare system or juvenile justice, because they are entitled to the same educational opportunities as everyone else. And as this indicates, there is a draft report that is going to the leadership of all of those agencies, and hopefully we will get the meeting set up with the heads of all those agencies to come to some decision that would help us amend some language in LB 511 to improve the quality of education for kids who are in the system. So the committee felt those bills needed to be once again re-emphasized with work that's gone on since last session and will be before the legislature in January.
So as a committee, we felt this was an important document to help all of you understand kind of the status as we move into the next legislative season of some of the in-progress bills and processes and what's occurred in that time period. The next document, unless you have any questions over that document, the next document is really a reflection of the committee work that we synthesized what some of the priorities, the legislative and regulatory priorities should be based on our conversations really throughout the year, and input from staff. This isn't, we've already figured out today, I think there's like 3 other items that have surfaced, and this is not yet inclusive of maybe all of the things that we need to try to put together, but the intent is that we end up at the end of the year, whether it be in November or December moving forward, with a document that helps all of us understand the priorities that may be legislative or regulatory priorities going forward, so that as we're out talking to constituents, we have a good understanding of what those may be. And this is designed around an area of trying to identify some key pieces that we need to move forward on. In the past, we talk a lot about the technical amendments, the cleanup bill. This starts to articulate what are some of those things, and so some items might be things that would be considered cleanup. Some items as we move forward are really important concepts that we want to build out in some capacity, either through potentially proposed legislation or legislation that we're aware of that some centers may be working on. So Brian, if you can walk us through this, it'd be great.
Sure. And we've organized this document, if you're going to see, with topical headings that go back to your strategic vision and direction, because that is what's guiding us. Under leadership, every year there's always challenges that come up. LB 377, the board supported last session to get rid of obsolete statutes with Class 1, Class 2, and Class 6 school districts, and that was all it was designed to do. Well, the Class 4 school district, if you understand how the statutes are written, it has to have a city of the primary class within its boundaries, which is the city of Lincoln. If you've been following recently, the city of Lincoln's population is growing, and by the 2020 census may actually have over 300,000 inhabitants, which by law makes it a city of the metropolitan class, which means the Class 4 school district would become a Class 5 school district. And there's a whole number of implications. This just gives the option that it can have a city of the primary or metropolitan class within its boundaries. It is intended to be just a non-controversial amendment, but as you can see, it does have other implications beyond that, for which the State Board Legislative Committee believe there's a need to continue to review all aspects of school district classifications and what actions may be needed in future years in that regard, so that's reflected down below. One of the other statutory changes about data collections, in the sense of the federal government requires all student data information be as of October 1st. Our state statutes require all enrollment data be as of the last Friday in September. That gets to be problematic because we ask our school districts to twice give us reports for federal and state purposes, and this past school year, the last Friday in September was September 30th, and the October 1st date was the following day, but they still had to give us 2 different data reports. This is trying to streamline, get state law in line so that one data, as we move to advisor, in the following years, it's one pull of data, not having them do 2 work. So again, this gives a little more flexibility, aligns data systems, so all of the stuff the commissioner showed you on student data helps streamline that process a little bit. And again, the board feels they have a role as the legislative committee to looking at all of those changes in demographics and how we improve student achievement. There's an ongoing conversation about educational service units, their role, the core services definition, boundaries of educational service units are all topical areas about leadership, of having conversations going forward on how best to utilize and address that. So I'll stop there.
So as we go through these, if there's any questions that you have, please feel free to. Thank you. If there's any questions that you have, please feel free to ask committee members or Brian. This again is our kind of first attempt of trying to put together something that all of us as board members can have at our fingertips, so when we're out having discussions, we have an understanding of what our kind of legislative and regulatory agenda may be. So if there's no questions, then Brian, continue on.
Okay, so this board has been discussing AQuest, has been discussing the ESSA plan. The legislative committee recognizes those are just pieces of things that still need work. Looking at the current Nebraska statutes, the board's legislative committee felt there was a need to change state statutes so that there is not less than 3 priority schools. Right now it's not more than, because we can align federal and state accountability, and using the same terminology, there are federal resources when next year comes when we have to identify not only priority schools, but schools in need of comprehensive support. That's the federal definition. So this would align to allow the board, you could refer to them all as priority schools instead of having to do that artificial distinction for state law and federal purposes. There is no intention of this having a cost to the state of Nebraska. It's more of better utilizing the federal resources and the state resources to address those schools we know need our greatest support. The second change would actually give this board the authority to reevaluate progress plans of a priority school after the third consecutive school year. Statute right now says you can't do that until the fifth school year. The need to, now there may be changes that need to occur. There may come that point in time, so this gives you more flexibility. And again, lines up with federal ESSA requirements on comprehensive support for schools. So in that regard, again, the legislative committee believes this is about bringing a single accountability system to the state of Nebraska, that you have the ability to address both of those things, state and federal, within the same system. The board's legislative committee also is looking at rule and other laws that go with that. Rule 10 to strengthen and align school district accreditation and accountability. This is ongoing work. We know we have to make updates to Rule 10. Some of this connects back to the governor's comments on our ESSA plan and the need to align that there. Some of that work can be done in Rule 10 in that regard. Again, back to Rule 84 and accountability and connecting ESU accreditation and their role in doing that work. That is probably both statutory and regulatory, but continuing to have a common vision and direction on that. Also exploring what is the role of the state board with the Educational Service Unit Coordinating Council, because it is its own political subdivision that is supposed to try to coordinate what all the ESUs are doing and bringing that. And then the same concept about the Coordinating Council for the learning community. You'll recall this past year you had to approve the achievement plan for the learning community that was supposed to be coordinating all the efforts of the school districts to improve student achievement. Those are items the legislative committee is saying we need to still be focused on, we still need to be looking at. Some of that may be statutory, some of that may be regulatory in that regard. So those are topics under accountability that the board legislative committee need to be publicly stated, and that work continue on, whether that's in the legislature or with the legislative committee, on our role as a state board and the department and working with those groups. So on page 2, we move over to student success and access, pre-kindergarten, early childhood education, and kindergarten programs. The board legislative committee has had some conversation on this. They feel there's a need to change appropriate statutes so that kindergarten services, pre-kindergarten programs, early childhood education programs, and kindergarten programs, there's 4 concepts for a very short time span in life for a child, to clarify definitions, because not all of those definitions used by the legislatures use those terms all the way through, nor consistently use those definitions. Right now, eliminate a mandate for certification for teachers in early childhood education from a particular statute while still retaining the state board's authority through regulations in Rule 11 to determine the qualifications and use of staff. Some of this is related to workforce, because we certainly are hearing from some there aren't enough qualified people out there in the greater part of Nebraska. But it's not giving up from the state board the necessity of having quality staff. It gives the board the flexibility, as opposed to a state statute mandating everywhere that topic, to transition kindergarten programs for offering instructional hours as all other elementary grades by the 2019-20 school year. There's a 1984 statute that says kindergarten only has to be 400 clock hours. That's 33 years old when you really think about it. When we pulled the data, there are only 5 school districts out of 244 who are not doing all day, every day kindergarten. So this is a topic and an issue. Those 5 would probably need some transition time, but this puts it out there on the radar, and there may be reasons that are there, but again, the legislative committee is not saying, well, we can just rest on 1984 and what we're doing. There is work that can be done in this area. And again, to provide flexibility and allow school districts to continue serving a child who turns 5 to to remain in a pre-kindergarten program. This issue has been there. Some of this is a rub of a statutory requirement, again, that goes back to 2004, to think through, is that absolute necessary in all cases, or is there some flexibility that still would remain with the state board to provide some flexibility if that's needed? So, again, under this very topic, there's a review of Rules 11 and 52. There's also a review of statutes and regulations to continue serving kids. Again, we're focusing on what's good for the kid, what does the child actually need in that regard. So again, this is putting it out there for to have the conversation and continue looking at what's best for children and what's best for families, along with our school systems providing the necessary services that meet the needs of the child. Well, we get into digital and virtual learning because that is becoming more and more. You have your state board goal for a digital repository to be established by 2020. I sound like I'm repeating the commissioner on some of his, but you can see there, believe it or not, there is an alignment here on a lot of these activities. We believe there's a need to clarify a statute to make it clear that if you're doing part-time enrollment of kids from non-public schools who don't reside in your school district, it still connects back to the statute for enrollment, and that's what I would call a cleanup technical, but it does need to get done, and it does promote this because we do know of a school district that's running a virtual school program right now, and some issues that have popped up this past year. We're trying to help them work through this. They need some assistance on that, so that is what that concept's dealing with. You had a budget issue that's still sitting there for funding for a digital learning repository. There's been interest just recently expressed by individuals related to Native Americans and the need for that to get incorporated better, not only in those schools, but across the state, and for all of us to understand the role of Native Americans in Nebraska history and our own process. So that's a concept that the board's legislative committee didn't want to forget. They're also recognizing, yeah, there's a budget issue that's going on, but it's still a conversation that still needs to occur. And again, about expanding accessibility of any digital repository that would be available to all schools, not public schools, all schools. That would even include parents who have their children in an exempt school, because all of this instructional material is for the betterment of the children's learning, regardless of where they attend the school. Again, we're looking at a Rule 10, strengthening and aligning that for digital and virtual learning as an ongoing conversation, and the same thing's true with the ESUs and the Coordinating Council on Digital and Virtual Learning. The last topic that is there is changing in 2 statutes the student discipline to require the school boards and the county attorney to annually review the student code of conduct to define such conduct that a principal shall report to law enforcement. Current statute has the principal reporting every violation of the student disciplinary code that could be a violation of the Nebraska criminal code.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We're building this off of the concept for attendance policies annually reviewed by the county attorney, playing the role of connector of bringing community organizations together to better think about what actually needs to be done in that area for that topic. So I'll stop there. That's not all of the items, because I will tell you, now that it's December, I don't want to tell you the number of contacts daily department staff get from the legislature with ideas, looking for ideas, wanting input, raising things, looking for cutting of costs. So by the January meeting, there may be a few more items that get added to this, because everybody's looking for places we can save money, meet the needs of the state budget, but getting rid of obsolete statutes that don't serve the purpose what they were intended to. So
Did you remind them it's a 60-day session?
that doesn't stop people asking questions and looking
I
for
understand
ideas.
that.
So in
I
that regard,
understand
the
that.
department has always been working on if there's ways to
I know.
streamline statutes. If we can get rid of old statutes, we're gonna help support any senator on a bill that
It
would
was a
do that.
rhetorical question.
Yes. So.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. In committee, do you have any other comments or? So thanks again to the committee. Thanks, Brian. This will come back in January, probably with some changes. Don't know how many changes Brian will find in the next couple of weeks, but for us to take action on and to adopt as our positions and
Thank you.
direction. Thank you.
Well, we have been sitting here for about 2 hours, so I think we're going to take about a 5-minute break. Mine.
I used to say that.
I would like to call the work session of the December meeting back into session. And our next report is on the Strategic Planning Performance and Improvement Committee. We have a discussion item, which is an update on the selection of a third priority school. Gail?
Drew, thanks. Good afternoon. Earlier today in our committee meeting, we started discussing some of the things that had gone on in 2015 when we did our initial classification of schools. And there was a 5-stage, 5-phase process that was developed. And through that process, 87 schools were identified as needing improvement. And from there, 3 schools were identified then as priority schools. As you know, Druid Hill has been removed from priority status, and so we're looking to replace Druid Hill as our third school. So rather than start over with the classification system, the plan is to look at the 84 schools that were not selected, and I'm going to arrow down here just a little bit. So phase 1 was really the initial classification. In phase 2, we were trying to narrow down the schools in need of improvement to help identify priority schools. And then in phase 3, that continued narrowing down from 20 schools it was at that time to 3. And as you know, we had an urban school, a Native American school, and a sparsely populated school chosen. With Druid Hill being one of our urban schools, being removed from priority status, it made sense to either choose an urban school again or a demographically shifting school. And so there have been some discussion about, wouldn't it be nice if we could find an urban school that was demographically shifting? And so there's a possibility of that happening, but we can't say for sure at this point. So where we're at right now, I kind of joked with the commissioner that we're really at 2.5. Our hope is to, and we have a group of NDE staff again, and our hope is to take trend data. One nice thing now is we have 3 years of data. The data from this year we just got, so that's what's kind of delayed things a little bit. One downside of that is that we've changed some tests in the meantime, so there's not necessarily an exact 3-year trend, because our NISA in 11th grade now is ACT, and so those scores won't align, but we still should be able to look at that data. And what we don't want to do is pick a school that's been showing positive trend lines. We want to continue to support them, but we wouldn't want necessarily to make them a priority school. And so once we have this data and our group can meet, we'll be moving forward on choosing 3 or 4 schools, and then we'd be moving into phase 4 at that point. And I appreciate so much a discussion earlier about the civic readiness, and that we need to take our time and make sure we do it right. That was said very clearly today in our committee meeting as well, that we need to be sure that, because my original plan or hope was to have a school named by January, but given the time of year and the difficulty there might be in contacting superintendents and principals at this time of year, it probably will be better to go slower to make sure we make a good selection, and that we have enough time to talk with some of those school leaders before making a final recommendation, which now has been moved to probably February, so we would try to do that.
Maureen?
I really appreciate the fact that you're bringing in these administrators in these schools that you're considering, in this group of schools that you are considering, so that they aren't, taken by surprise, so that they have some input in ahead of time. And I think that was something that we learned the first time around.
Any other questions? John?
Piggyback on what you're saying, Maureen, I would suspect with the success that Druid Hill had in regards to its, if you will, popularity for what it's come through with the priority status, would you believe that this is going to be a little bit, if you will, easier in regards to making that selection?
Well, I think the selection process may not be necessarily easier, but I think the schools will be more receptive to being chosen. I don't think any school likes to hear that they have a school in need of improvement, but given some of the positive feedback Druid Hill has gotten, and I think also we've had presentations from Loop County and Santee that they also now feel that the process has been very helpful to them. So I do think the schools will be more receptive to getting the help as a priority school status.
Understand. Thank you.
Rachel?
Just one comment to pick up. I think the advantage also of moving to February from January, we talked a lot about the important role boards play and the local board playing in this process. And in January 1, our board meeting would be before many school districts meet. And in many cases, it's a new board in January. And so to make sure that you've engaged the leadership, including a board, in this conversational process before we make a decision, I think would be problematic in trying to have this recommendation ready by January. So thanks for considering that.
Okay. Patrick?
I've been nagging the commissioner about when are we going to start moving on this. And I appreciate the fact that you provided what appears to be some kind of a timeline. I just think that as we go forward, it's important to have that process pretty well defined so that we know when we remove someone that what is the immediate processes that we're taking. I think that I know there are at least 1 or 2 state senators again that are concerned about this priority school process, and I think it's in our best interest to be able to basically as soon as we remove one, say the process has already started, and this is kind of the timeline or the processes that we're going to go through. So I appreciate what you've done, but I just think we need to be more visible in how we handle this in the future.
Okay, a great point. And I think coming on the heels of what will be our new classification in the fall, where we will identify other schools in need of comprehensive support, we may still have some of our current schools on priority status, and so we will have to have that replacement process ready to go so that we aren't waiting 6 months in the future.
Matt?
I just want to add the one point too, that as we transitioned away with Druid Hill, we've actually maintained a lot of contact right now on that very process. So it was the first time we actually exited a school, and so that actually takes resources and time and attention to try to make that exit process also good. So we want our process to select them to be very solid, and our process to exit and support them on the way through. I think as we get better at this, and I think that's our intention with the possibility of legislative changes that allow us more the kind of synergy with the ESSA plan and how that will also come together. And there's still some moving parts, but I appreciate it. I mean, the more we can get the process really clear, and I think I asked that question of staff too, is like how do we ensure that we're able to kind of make this work? Because we have to be able to scale this up, at least underneath the vision we've identified.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can just add to
Rachel?
that, Commissioner, I think one of the important discussions we had at committee level that's important for all board is to really understand the expectation of follow-up with the school that's exiting. That even though they may be exiting, there'd be a process of monitoring and reporting back as well to the board. And I think you've thought through a time frame for that and those kinds of pieces. So bringing that forward at some point I think would be advantageous.
Molly?
And in our meeting, we also talked in this topic about sustainability, that the report, not just to support them post-exiting, but that they also would be part of an annual report, so we can show other schools that exit out of priority status that this is how you continue functioning and show accountability at a local level.
Anybody else? Thanks.
Yep, thank you.
Commissioner, do you have anything else that you want to mention under strategic planning?
Yeah, I'm going to go really quick. I think the other thing, and I don't know if other committee members, but I think we had a nice conversation in strategic planning about the kind of timing of reports, and it's a little bit awkward because I'm trying to report on what we've done on the strategic plan as part of my process with with my appraisal process, but also there's a responsibility for the board to keep track of the plan. And I think we had a very good conversation about thinking about quarterly reports and some of the data reporting that I was trying to show you anyway. I could imagine that really being automated as part of that process going into the next year, thoughtful about how that kind of third-party evaluation piece would work, and the role of that committee in that effort, I think, is really very, very important.
We did have that conversation this morning because the strategic plan was put together by the board in a way to hold us accountable as well. And so I think that it's important that we step forward and make sure that we're honoring our own accountability. And also that when we do this, that it fits in. And then we talked about the fact that we have also committed to having an outside facilitator come in and look at, are we following our plan? Are we making progress? And so having this quarterly piece put together next year, that gives us the opportunity to then plan for that third party to come in and do that evaluation, as we indicated in our strategic plan that we wanted to do as well. So, okay. Anything else? Okay, John, would you report on budget and finance?
Thank you very much. We had one action item to approve the 2018 trust fund budget for the Nebraska Center for the Education of Children who are blind or visually impaired. We had speakers Greg Prochazka and Sally Schreiner bless us today with their attendance with a quick summary of the funds and the expenses. Quick summary, if I may. Overall, the budgeted amounts for the trust funds have stayed very consistent from year to year. It was noted that generally they spend significantly less than what is budgeted, which is a result of budgeting for contingencies, as they do not know in advance in how many students will need technology or will qualify for national competitions. Students both at the Nebraska City location and across the state may be using technology provided by the Nebraska Center of the Education of Children who are blind or visually impaired. We discussed the process for disbursements from these trust funds, since NDE is the administrator of the trust. Disbursements requests must be submitted to NDE, which then reviews and pre-audits the request before funds are dispersed. It was also noted that these funds are subject to the same audit requirements as the state funds and would be included in the CAFR and attestation audits. And we will be bringing that for approval tomorrow, and all committee members approved. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, we'll move to item 5, board reports, dates, and discussion items. Do we have any joint meetings coming up? Are you aware of? I haven't heard of any. Okay. This is now where we move into reports on what board members have been attending. We have several board members that attended the meeting in November with NASB, and we have been working on in the past to improve our efficiency and expedite things. That the people that we had attend the conference with NASB, I would ask them if they have any comments. Rachel.
I'll be quick. I'm just going to highlight one of the sessions that was about student voices. It was really outstanding, and a reminder that I think we should incorporate student voice more often. But a couple of the highlights, it was a panel of students from across the state. But a couple of the questions that they responded to were what helps kids succeed, and a follow-up question was what prevents student success. And an interesting report that several of the students talked about is what helped kids succeed is teachers and administrators believing in students and setting high expectations for those students. And what prevents student success was the lack of expectations. And then the other piece they brought was having a great support system at school and at home is success, and lack of is what prevents success. Another piece that they talked about on what makes teachers and administrators effective, a lot of the conversation was around visibility. And some of the small schools talked about their examples were seeing the superintendent, and the superintendent not being in the office, but the superintendent being around the building and at all activities, not just certain activities. And then in the larger school response was similar, but for the building principal. For the building principal to be visible around in classrooms and at all activities, not just certain activities. And so again, great opportunity. One thing that hit my heart well was when they asked, what could you change your ad, they wanted home ec classes back. So and they called it home ec classes, so maybe I need to go back. No, they said home ec. So there you go. All right, Patrick?
I'll be short. I really was impressed with the keynote speakers again. You know, I thought John O'Leary, boy, if you wanted an opportunity to see how somebody has overcome, you know, a significant tragedy in their life.
Wow, yeah.
He was powerful. At an early age, he managed to ignite a gasoline can and it flew back at him, and he lost fingers, and he was, you know, he went through I don't know how many operations, and it was just it was inspirational. And the other two speakers were equally good. There is one thing that came to mind, and I've had a couple conversations with Frank Daly of the NADC lately, and one of those things I still need to talk to the commissioner about, I think, but I wish Brian were here right now. He seems to have disappeared, but there was some concern talked on, particularly on the issue of approving travel expenses and expenses for board members, that the state is looking at very seriously, that at least as far as school boards across the state, basically the message was, I, Pat McPherson, cannot vote for my own expenses when we have a vote here. And so I think we need to look at that very carefully. And talk to Frank Daly about that. That came out of that, and there were a lot of other good sessions I attended, but I think that's important.
I just saw a head nod from Scott Summers as counsel, so we'll talk more about that,
Yeah, okay. Molly?
I really thought it was excellent education conference. I think we as state board members representing major segments of geographic location need to really go and listen. And I think besides the scheduled meetings, the networking opportunities, just the question and answer following each of the sessions were really important to see what was tugging their heartstrings and sometimes their purse strings, and see how it worked together. I would just make two brief comments since it's already 5 o'clock. The first was about the pre-conference, and it was the Gallup Strengths Quest. Yes. And Matt, I wonder if possibly a future board retreat might consider having a mini Gallup Strength Quest thing with board members. Maybe when we get our new elections in 2 years, or when, I guess in a year from now, you'll have new board members. Because what it really talked about is, and it was neat because John was there by me, and several of us are at the same table, but it talked about how you do this inventory, but you find out how all of us have different talents, and it's like 1 in 300,000 really match up with you. But it talked about how sometimes not only do we have different talents that work together, but sometimes even the way that we communicate, the other person doesn't understand because we're coming from different places. So I would just advocate possibly Gallup has a survey for our students, and they might want to work with the board in some sort of retreat when we get new board members, just to get to know each other and then to have talents be integrated. And then the second thing I was going to bring up, I stayed from the beginning till the end, and I just really enjoyed learning. Even though I've been on now 7 years, I still find that it helps me learn more about how to better serve not only my school districts, but to see what they're doing in their districts. And John will like this, especially because you go around to the vendors, and there are the architects and the engineers and the bus drivers and the people providing services. And one thing that the engineers said, they're really having trouble finding a good pool of like bricklayers in their new construction sites and the electricians and the trades. So they actually said, I got some good feedback. They said, please make sure that when you're doing your career tech ed, you're showing, you're discussing how important it is to have some even EVAs reflect the students that are going into industry certification, the dual 2 and 4 credit, dual credit for 2-year colleges, and then on. And they just said, I hope you continue celebrating it, because there is sometimes just a total absence. And the last one that kind of surprised me is, have you ever been to an electrician meeting or been by one? It's mostly male.
Yeah.
And the electricians just said, we really need, when you're pushing tech with women, push them with the trades too. So those are just 2 highlights for me.
Thank you. John, did you have anything?
Mo, did you have anything?
She wasn't there.
Oh, okay. No, but I would like to, if I may, just give me a minute and let me kind of go through real quick what transpired for me in regards to, besides the NASB conference, outstanding in every way. I represented the board at a Thanksgiving meal in South Omaha where we gave, if you will, persons in need a Thanksgiving meal. The Latino Center had a graduation, GED graduation at Bryan High School, and they allowed me to officiate part of the ceremony. It was an exceptional ceremony, no doubt about it. Represented the board at a dance contest for Arts in Omaha. Arts in Ocean. I judged some of the 5th graders. They had, the Omaha Playhouse was just packed with parents and students, and they had these dance teams, and I knew enough to make, I can judge, but I can't dance. No, Also, Lisa and I attended the NSEA Metro Legislative Dinner they had a couple weeks ago, and also attended a tobacco education advocacy for the Midlands. They're starting that up in Papillion. The groundbreaking ceremony for the new Papillion Recreation Center, and also I met with representatives from the Sherwood Foundation and the NAACP in regards to educational benefits for next year in regards to their goals, their strategic plan. And discussed education options with and testing with Lieutenant Colonel, your friend Mo Prueza of the National Guard. They still talk about that flight that you took with them.
You must have made quite an impression.
And 3 of us went to the NCSA, the Nebraska Conference of School Administrators, or pre-legislative conference yesterday, and that was very nice. So thank you very much, Mike Delaney, for your hospitality.
Rachel?
I'll just have one other thing that I'll add, because ditto on a few things there, but I want to give a shout out to Pender Public Schools. I was able to attend their National Blue Ribbon award ceremony, and again, a great job for Pender Elementary School, and it was a wonderful celebration of their success.
Okay, does anyone else have anything? Molly?
I was just going to let you know, tomorrow or Friday afternoon when you go to your holiday celebration, I will be driving to NACIA, the state curriculum directors in Kearney. They're meeting at the Museum of Nebraska Art. So,
they finally decided where they were going to meet.
Yeah, they're meeting tomorrow. So.
Well, we'll try to do our due diligence in the morning so you're not. Okay, and that brings us, what a wonderful transition, into those who have requested attendance at meetings. That's on your list. Some were places that you'd already attended, and as Molly said, there's a meeting on the 8th. NERCSA is meeting February 20th here in Lincoln, and Molly has requested attendance. The Gifted Association is meeting the 22nd in Omaha, and Molly and Patsy and Lisa have requested attendance. And that's all I have right now, but if you have a travel request, Molly?
You know what, please take me off the Gifted Conference. We have 2 other people going, and that way if somebody else wants to go, I'd be happy to give them my place.
I'd like to go for the Gifted Conference.
Okay, we'll just, okay, thank you. Anything else? If you have it, please see Ryan tomorrow, or Laura, and we can approve those requests then tomorrow. The monthly travel expense report is attached for you to review. And if there's nothing else to come before the board for the good of the order, we will have our regularly scheduled meeting of the State Board of Education. We'll reconvene at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning in this room. Thank you.
Anybody wants anything pulled off the consent agenda?